The afternoon sun pushed its way through the large glass panels that lined the back wall of the common room, casting long, bright rectangles across the beige carpet. It was not a soft or gentle light. It was harsh and honest, revealing every speck of dust floating in the air and every scuff mark on the linoleum floor near the kitchenette. The room smelled faintly of lunch, roasted chicken that had been served hours ago, and the clean, sharp scent of disinfectant that always seemed to linger in the hallways. Ilara walked into the center of this space with her black music folder clutched tightly against her chest. She was young, a student from the city conservatory, dressed in a skirt that felt too formal and shoes that clicked a little too loudly on the floor. She was nervous, her heart beating a fast rhythm against her ribs, but she was also filled with a quiet kind of determination. Today was important to her. It was not just a volunteer assignment. It was a chance to prove she could handle a real audience, even if this audience was quite different from the concert halls she was used to. In the middle of the room, sitting slightly off-kilter on a portable rug, was the facility's piano. It was an upright model, not the grand Steinway she practiced on at school, but it looked decent enough. It had a polished, dark brown finish that reflected the ceiling lights. Ilara walked up to it, adjusting the bench to her height. She ran her fingers over the keys, testing the action. They were a little stiff, but they would do. Around the perimeter of the room, the residents were gathering. They arrived slowly, some using walkers, others in wheelchairs pushed by aides. There were about 20 of them in total. They settled into a semicircle, their faces a map of wrinkles and soft expressions. A woman in a knitted shawl closed her eyes immediately, tilting her head back. A man near the front stared vacantly at a television screen mounted on the wall, even though it was turned off. Mrs. Gable, the activity director, gave Ilara a reassuring nod from the side of the room. She was a brisk woman with a kind face who seemed happy to have some entertainment for the group. "Whenever you're ready, dear," Mrs. Gable whispered, her hands clasped together. Ilara nodded back. She opened her folder and placed the sheet music on the stand. It was a heavy piece of music. She had chosen a complex prelude by Rachmaninoff, a piece known for its thundering chords and lightning-fast runs. Her professors had told her that to be a great musician, one must play with power and precision. She believed that if she played something difficult, something that showed off her skill, she would earn their respect. She thought they would be impressed by the complexity, the same way her teachers were. She wanted to show them that she was serious, that she was an artist. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Ilara closed her eyes for a split second, visualized the notes, and then let her fingers fall. The sound that erupted was loud and aggressive. The opening chords were meant to be dramatic, crashing like waves. She played them with force, pouring all her anxiety and energy into the instrument. The piano, which usually sat silent in this quiet room, suddenly roared. The noise filled every corner, bouncing off the glass windows and the tiled ceiling. Ilara focused intensely on the music. Her eyes darted across the page, tracking the dense forest of notes. Her hands moved up and down the keyboard, striking the keys with precision. She was sweating slightly, her forehead furrowed in concentration. She felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it. This was the power of music. She was sure that if she looked up, she would see everyone captivated, stunned by the sound filling the room. However, as she transitioned into a quieter, more intricate section of the piece, she chanced a quick glance at the audience. She expected to see eyes fixed on her. She expected to see heads turning, attention grabbed. Instead, the scene in front of her was almost exactly the same as when she started. The woman in the knitted shawl was still asleep, her breathing rhythmic and undisturbed by the crashing chords. The man staring at the blank television hadn't moved. In the second row, two ladies were chatting quietly to one another. One of them was pointing to a bracelet on her wrist, smiling, completely ignoring the storm of music happening just a few feet away. Ilara felt a twitch of confusion in her chest, but she kept playing. She told herself it was just the beginning. She needed to get to the climax. She played faster, her fingers flying over the ivory keys. The music grew intense again, demanding attention. It was a physical effort now. She was attacking the piano, trying to force the sound into their ears, trying to make them understand what she was doing. A nurse walked through the side of the room, pushing a cart with plastic cups of water. The wheels of the cart squeaked, a high-pitched, rhythmic squeak that cut through the melody Alara was struggling to maintain. The nurse didn't stop. She didn't even look at Alara. She just kept pushing her cart, distributing water to the people who were watching her with mild interest. Alara's cheeks began to burn. A strange feeling of panic began to mix with her determination. Why weren't they listening? This was hard music. This was important music. She was playing perfectly. She wasn't missing a single note, but the room felt indifferent. The atmosphere was not one of a concert. It was just another Tuesday afternoon in a room full of people who were waiting for dinner. She hit a wrong note, a jarring sound in the middle of a smooth run. She flinched but kept going, correcting it quickly. She played louder, trying to drown out the squeak of the cart, the murmur of voices, and the sound of the air conditioning unit humming above. She poured her soul into the ending, her hands moving in a blur, the final chords ringing out with as much force as she could muster. When she played the last note, she lifted her hands off the keys, keeping them in the air for a dramatic pause. She sat there, breathing hard, waiting for the silence that follows a great performance. The room was quiet for a moment, but it wasn't the silence of awe. It was just the silence of people going about their day. The man in the front row coughed loudly, a wet, rattling cough. The nurse with the cart finished her round and pushed it out the side exit. The two ladies in the second row giggled at something one of them whispered. Alara lowered her hands to her lap. She looked out at the rows of faces. No one was clapping. No one was looking at her with admiration. Most of them were just looking around or at their hands or sleeping. It was as if she hadn't played anything at all. She felt a sudden, sharp drop in her stomach, a terrible sinking feeling. She had prepared for weeks, practicing until her fingers ached, believing that if she could just play it perfectly, she would reach them. But looking at their bored, tired faces, she realized she had played for herself, not for them. She had brought a sledgehammer to a place that needed a gentle touch. She sat frozen on the bench, her face hot with embarrassment, realizing that her grand performance had been nothing more than background noise. The heavy silence that followed the final chord was not the kind Alara had dreamed about. In her mind, the silence would have been electric, charged with the energy of a crowd stunned by brilliance. But this silence was just empty. It was the sound of a room that had paused, waiting for the noise to stop so it could go back to being a room. Alara sat on the bench, her hands hovering slightly over the keys, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her palms were damp with sweat, making the ivory keys feel slippery. She looked out at the semicircle of chairs, hoping for a sign, any sign that her hard work had meant something. But the faces looking back were blank or turned away or simply closed. Mrs. Gable, the activity director, realized that no one else was going to clap. She stepped forward from the side wall and began a slow, rhythmic clapping. It was polite, the kind of clapping you give when you don't really know what else to do. "Wonderful technique, Alara," she said, her voice pitched a little too high. "Thank you for sharing that with us." A few of the residents stirred. One or two joined in the clapping lazily, tapping their hands together without much enthusiasm. It was a dutiful sound, not a grateful one. It felt like a participation trophy, and it stung Alara more than if they had booed. She forced a tight smile, gave a small, quick nod, and stood up. She felt shaky, not from the physical exertion of playing, but from the crushing weight of disappointment. She had been so sure that excellence would bridge the gap between her world and theirs. She thought technical perfection was a universal language. She was wrong. She began to gather her sheet music, her fingers fumbling with the pages as she tried to smooth them out and slide them back into the black folder. She wanted to pack up and leave, to get out of this bright, sterile room where she felt so exposed. She kept her head down, focusing on the task of closing the folder, avoiding eye contact with the audience. Too loud? The voice was thin and raspy, but it cut through the air like a jagged piece of glass. Alara froze. She looked up slowly. Coming from the second row was a woman named Esther. Esther was small and bird-like, with a knitted shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the warmth of the room. Her eyes were sharp, however, clear and focused directly on Alara. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. She looked merely annoyed, as if Alara had tracked mud onto a clean floor. "It was just noise, dear," Esther continued, her voice carrying across the hushed space. Far too much banging. We asked for music, not a thunderstorm. Alara felt her face flush hot red. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain that it was a masterpiece, a classic piece of art, but the words died in her throat. Behind Esther, a few heads nodded in agreement. A man in a plaid shirt shifted uncomfortably in his wheelchair. I couldn't hear myself think, he muttered, looking down at his lap. Mrs. Gable hurried over, looking flustered. Now, Esther, Alara is a very talented student. She came all the way from the conservatory to play for us. I don't care where she came from, Esther said, not breaking eye contact with Alara. It wasn't nice, it was aggressive. Play something simple, something we know. Something that doesn't make my chest hurt. Alara stood there, clutching her music folder against her chest like a shield. She felt a strange mix of humiliation and sudden clarity. For weeks, she had viewed this performance as a test of her skill. She had practiced the Rachmaninoff until she could play it in her sleep, measuring her success by the speed of her fingers and the power of her chords. She had treated the residents like a jury that needed to be convinced of her talent. But looking at Esther and at the others around her, she saw that they didn't care about her talent. They didn't care about conservatories or technique or how many hours she had practiced. They just wanted to feel something good. They wanted comfort. She had brought them a sledgehammer when they were asking for a lullaby. You're right, Alara said softly. Her voice was quiet, but in the sudden stillness of the room, everyone heard her. She looked at Esther, really looked at her, and let go of her defensiveness. I'm sorry, it was too much. Mrs. Gable looked surprised, but she stepped back, waiting to see what would happen. Do you know any songs? A voice asked from the front row. Alara turned to look. It was Mr. Henderson, a resident she had noticed earlier. He was frail, his hands trembling as they rested on the blanket covering his legs. He looked up at her with watery, pale eyes. My wife. She used to sing to me, he said, his voice trailing off for a moment before he gathered his strength. Do you know You Are My Sunshine? It was such a simple request. The song was one of the first things a child learns on the piano. It had only 3 chords, a melody that repeated itself, and words that everyone knew. In her world at the conservatory, a song like that was considered beneath notice. It was easy music, but looking at Mr. Henderson's face, seeing the hope in his eyes, Alara realized that simplicity was not a lack of skill. Sometimes simplicity was the hardest thing to play, because it required baring your soul instead of hiding behind technique. Alara looked down at her heavy black folder filled with complex sonatas and concertos. She thought about the dense notes, the difficult fingerings, the hours of lonely practice. Then she looked back at Mr. Henderson. She thought about her own mother and the simple songs she used to hum in the kitchen when Alara was a little girl. She thought about how safe those songs made her feel. I know that one, Alara said. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that day. She turned back to the piano bench and sat down, but this time she didn't open her folder. She pushed the heavy book of sheet music to the very edge of the piano, letting it lean against the music stand. She wouldn't need it. She didn't need to read the notes for this. She placed her hands on the keys again. The air in the room felt different now. The tension, the pressure to perform, to impress, to prove herself, it all evaporated. The atmosphere shifted from a concert hall to a living room. The residents stopped looking at her as a distant performer on a stage and started looking at her like a person. Okay, Mr. Henderson, Alara said, her voice gentle. This is for you. She took a breath, but it wasn't the deep, calculating breath she took before the Rachmaninoff. It was a soft breath, one meant to calm her own heart. She felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't going to play to show off anymore. She was going to play to connect. She was going to play something that wasn't about her hands, but about their hearts. As her fingers pressed down on the keys to start the familiar melody, she knew that this was the real test, and she was finally ready to take it. Alara sat on the bench. Her back straight, but her shoulders significantly lower than they had been 10 minutes ago. The heavy black binder of classical sheet music sat pushed to the far edge of the piano, leaning precariously against the music stand. She had looked at Mr. Henderson and heard his request for You Are My Sunshine. But something else had stirred inside her as she placed her fingers on the cool ivory keys. She thought about the word simple. In the world she lived in at the conservatory, simple was a bad word. Simple meant easy. Simple meant you weren't working hard enough. But looking at the faces in the room, the tired eyes, the hands that shook with age, the confusion that clouded so many of their expressions, she realized that simple was exactly what they needed. They didn't need a puzzle to solve with their ears, they needed a memory to hold. Instead of the cheerful, upbeat tune Mr. Henderson had asked for, Ilara let her hands find the opening notes of a lullaby. It was Brahms' Lullaby, a melody so old and so familiar that it felt like it had always existed in the air, just waiting for someone to catch it. She played the first few notes softly. The sound was not a crash this time. It was a whisper. The piano, which had seemed like a weapon under her hands just moments ago, suddenly felt like an old friend. The notes floated out into the room, light and gentle, drifting over the carpet like falling leaves. The change in the room was immediate, though it was not loud or dramatic. It was a shift in the atmosphere, like the wind dying down on a choppy lake. The side conversations, which had continued stubbornly through the Rachmaninoff off-piece, trickled away. The nurse who had been wiping down a table in the corner stopped moving. The squeak of a sneaker on the floor ceased. Everyone seemed to be listening, not because they were forced to by the volume, but because the sound was inviting them in. Ilara played the melody slowly. She took her time with each phrase, stretching the notes out so they rang in the air. She wasn't thinking about finger placement or dynamics or what her professors would say. She was thinking about her own mother. She remembered being a little girl, sick with a fever, feeling hot and restless in her bed. She remembered her mother sitting on the edge of the mattress, humming this very tune, stroking her hair until the restlessness settled into sleep. As she played, she poured that memory into the keys. She tried to play it the way her mother had hummed it, with love, with patience, and with a deep, steady calm. She stripped away all the fancy trills and decorations she might have added in a recital. She played it plain and pure. She looked up from her hands to see how they were receiving it. Esther, the woman who had complained about the noise, had closed her eyes. Her face, which had been pinched and critical earlier, was now smooth and relaxed. Her head bobbed very slightly to the rhythm, a tiny movement that showed she was following the melody. Mr. Henderson, the man who had wanted the song about sunshine, was staring at the floor, but a small smile played on his lips. It seemed the gentle rhythm of the lullaby was close enough to what he needed. Perhaps it reminded him of his wife, perhaps of his own childhood, or perhaps it just felt nice. It didn't matter exactly what memory it triggered. What mattered was that it was reaching him. Ilara felt a lump form in her throat. This was a strange feeling for a musician. Usually when she played well, she felt a rush of adrenaline or pride. But this was different. This felt like a conversation. She was speaking to them without words, and for the first time since she arrived, they were answering her with their presence. As the last notes of the lullaby faded into the quiet room, Ilara did not stop. She did not lift her hands. She let the silence hang for just a heartbeat, and then she began to play again. This time she transitioned into Danny Boy. It was a song everyone knew, a song often associated with loss and saying goodbye. She played it even slower than the lullaby. She treated every chord like a precious object. She didn't rush from one note to the next. She let the bass notes ring out deep and full while the melody sang high and clear above them. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow through the large windows. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the beams, making them look like tiny stars. The room felt warmer, softer. Ilara watched as a man in the back row, who had been slumped over in sleep for most of the hour, slowly opened his eyes. He didn't look around. He just looked straight ahead, listening. A woman near the door, who had been knitting a scarf without looking at it, lowered her needles to her lap. Her eyes glistened with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. It was a powerful realization for Ilara. She had spent so many years trying to be perfect, trying to hit every note with mathematical precision. She thought that was how you moved people. But sitting there in this simple room with a group of people she had never met, she understood the truth. Music wasn't about the notes on the page. It was about the space between the notes. It was about the emotion you carried in your heart while you played. She thought about her mother again, about how much she missed her since she had passed away. She let that sadness flow through her arms and into the piano. She played Danny Boy not as a performance piece, but as a prayer. It was a farewell, a hello, and a hug, all wrapped into one melody. The sound was so full of feeling that it seemed to make the air heavy and sweet. The silence in the room was absolute now. No one coughed. No one shifted in their chair. No one looked at the clock on the wall. They were all transported. The music had acted as a key, unlocking doors in their minds that had been shut tight by time and illness. For these few minutes, they weren't old or frail or confused. They were just people, listening to a song that touched the part of them that was still young and alive. Ilara closed her own eyes for a moment, letting the music take her away too. She wasn't a student trying to prove herself anymore. She was just a daughter sharing a memory with a room full of strangers who felt like family. She played on, lost in the beauty of the simplicity she had once scorned, realizing it was the most difficult and most rewarding thing she had ever done. The melody of Danny Boy drifted through the room, hanging in the air like a soft fog. Ilara did not rush. She played each phrase with a care that made the notes feel heavy, weighted with meaning. The complex runs and thunderous chords of earlier were gone, replaced by something far more difficult to execute: honesty. It is easy to play fast. It is hard to play simply and make it count. As her fingers moved over the keys, Ilara kept her eyes open, watching the people in front of her. She wasn't looking at them as an audience anymore. She was looking at them as individuals, each carrying a lifetime of stories. She saw the way the light from the window caught the silver hair of the woman in the front row. She saw the worn texture of Mr. Henderson's sweater. She saw the hands resting on laps, hands that had built houses, held children, cooked meals, and worked hard jobs. These hands were now still, or trembling with age, but they had lived. The music seemed to act as a key, turning in locks that had been rusted shut for years. Esther, the woman who had been so sharp and critical just minutes ago, had completely changed. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing had slowed down to match the rhythm of the song. The harsh lines around her mouth and forehead had smoothed out. She looked younger somehow, as if the music was stripping away the years and the frustration, leaving only the peaceful woman underneath. Her head tilted slightly to the side, leaning toward the sound like a flower turning toward the sun. Then there was Mr. Henderson. He had stopped trembling. His hands, which had been fidgeting nervously with the blanket on his lap, lay still. He was staring past Ilara, looking through the piano and the wall behind it. His eyes were glassy, fixed on a scene that only he could see. Perhaps he was seeing a green hill in Ireland, or perhaps he was seeing the face of his wife again, hearing her voice singing the words he couldn't speak anymore. The music had given him a ticket to leave this sterile room and go back to a place where he felt loved and safe. Ilara felt a tightness in her chest, a mixture of sadness and profound warmth. She thought about her own mother again. She remembered how her mother used to sit at the kitchen table in the early morning, the house dark and quiet, drinking tea. Those moments were simple, unremarkable on the surface, but now they felt sacred. Ilara realized that this was what she was playing for, not a concert hall full of critics, but for the quiet moments that make up a life. She played the chorus of the song, the notes climbing high and then drifting back down. She didn't try to sound like a professional pianist. She didn't try to impress anyone with her dynamics. She played it the way she would hum it to herself if she were alone in her room. She let the imperfections in, the slight hesitations, because those imperfections made it human. The piano, an old upright with a slightly sticky action, seemed to appreciate the gentleness. The tone was warm and woody, not brilliant or sharp, but comforting. Around the room, the atmosphere continued to shift. The air felt thicker, charged with an emotion that everyone could feel but no one needed to name. It was a shared experience of loss, but also of love. The music acknowledged that life was hard, that people left, that time moved too fast, but it also offered a reminder that beauty remained. Mrs. Gable, the activity director, was standing near the glass doors. She had stopped checking her watch. She had stopped looking at her clipboard. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and she was leaning back against the wall, her eyes closed. She looked as if she was taking a deep breath after holding it in for a very long time. Even the staff members who were passing by in the hallway slowed down, pausing to look inside, drawn by the sound that was different from the usual noise of the facility. Ilara reached the bridge of the song. Her hands moved further apart on the keyboard, the left hand playing a low, steady heartbeat while the right hand sang the melody above it. She thought about how strange it was that she had been so afraid of these people. She had been afraid of their silence, of their age, of the possibility that they wouldn't like her. Now she felt a deep sense of connection. She didn't need them to clap. She didn't need them to tell her she was talented. The way they were sitting there, listening with their whole souls, was the only validation she needed. She looked at a man in the back who had been asleep when she started. He was awake now. He was looking at Alara and his eyes were wet. He didn't look confused anymore. He looked like he understood everything. It was as if the music had cleared the fog in his brain for just a few minutes, allowing him to be present, to really be there. That fleeting clarity was a gift, and Alara knew she was the one giving it just by pressing down on keys. The song was nearing its end. Alara could feel the emotion rising in her own throat. She wasn't playing a song about a boy going off to war or a lover saying goodbye anymore. She was playing a song about holding on, about remembering, about the enduring power of love even when people are gone. She poured every ounce of her longing for her mother, her compassion for these residents, and her newfound understanding of what music was for into the final bars. She played the last line of the melody slowly, drawing it out. She wanted it to last forever. She wanted to freeze time so that no one would have to go back to their rooms. No one would have to remember that they were old and forgotten. She wanted this moment of connection to be the only thing that existed. Her fingers found the final chord. She didn't strike it loudly. She pressed the keys down gently, sinking the weight of her arm into the piano so the sound would resonate deep and full. It was a G major chord, simple and pure. She held it, feeling the vibration of the strings traveling up through the bench and into her body. And then she lifted her hands. The silence that followed was not the empty, awkward silence of before. It was full, it was heavy. It was a living, breathing thing. No one moved, no one coughed, no one shuffled their feet. The chords seemed to hang in the air, echoing in their hearts. The sun had dipped lower, casting long, golden shadows across the floor, bathing the room in a warm glow that made everything look like a memory. Alara sat there, her hands resting in her lap, looking at the keys. She didn't turn around. She didn't stand up to bow. She just sat with the silence, honoring it. She knew that to break the spell now would be wrong. She had given them something real, and they were holding it close. The music had stopped, but the feeling was still there, washing over everyone in the room, binding them together in that quiet, golden space. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace she had never found in a conservatory classroom, knowing that she had finally, truly played. The silence that filled the room was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with things that could not be spoken, with memories that had suddenly surfaced, and with a shared sense of peace that no one had expected to find that afternoon. Alara sat on the bench, her hands resting quietly in her lap, looking down at the keys. She did not turn around to take a bow. She did not stand up to receive her applause. In this place, applause would have felt like a rude noise, a disruption of something sacred. The clapping of hands would have shattered the delicate glass of the moment. She sat there, listening to the quiet. It was so deep that she could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette down the hall. She could hear the rhythmic breathing of the residents. It was a living, breathing silence. Slowly, carefully, Alara lowered the keyboard cover. The felt lining met the keys with a dull, soft thud. It was the sound of a door closing gently on a room full of sleeping children. She reached out and gathered her sheet music, sliding the pages back into the black folder. Her hands were steady now. The nervousness that had made her fingers shake earlier was completely gone. She felt a strange calm, a lightness in her chest that she had never felt after a performance before. It was not the excitement of winning, but the deep satisfaction of giving exactly what was needed. She stood up and turned around to face the room. Mr. Henderson was crying. He wasn't making a sound, but tears were streaming down his face, tracking through the deep wrinkles of his cheeks. He wasn't wiping them away. He just let them fall, staring at the spot where the piano stood as if the music were still hanging in the air in front of him. Alara looked at him and felt a pang of sympathy, but it wasn't a sad feeling. It felt right, as if he had been holding onto those tears for a long time, and the music had finally given him permission to let them go. Esther, the woman who had told her the music was too loud, had her eyes open now. She was looking directly at Alara. The sharp, critical look was gone. Her face was soft, her eyes slightly glassy. She didn't smile, but she gave Alara a slow, deliberate nod. It was a seal of approval, more meaningful than any standing ovation she had ever received. It was an acknowledgement that she had been heard and that she had understood. Mrs. Gable, the activity director, was standing near the side wall. She had a hand pressed over her heart, and her eyes were shiny. She didn't say "good job" or "thank you for coming." She just looked at Alara with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, as if she had witnessed a small miracle. Alara picked up her bag and slung it over her shoulder. She felt different as she walked toward the center aisle. The carpet felt softer under her shoes, or perhaps she was just walking more lightly. As she moved between the rows of chairs to leave, the residents began to react. They didn't call out to her. They didn't ask for an encore. Instead, they reached out. It started with a man in a wheelchair on the end of the first row. As Alara passed, he slowly lifted his hand. It was trembling, but he reached it out toward her. Alara stopped. She didn't say anything. She simply stepped closer and gently took his hand in hers. It was warm and dry, the skin paper-thin. He squeezed her fingers with a surprising amount of strength. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a cloudy emotion, and he patted her hand. He didn't have the words to say what he was feeling, but the squeeze said it all. "I felt it. I was there." "Thank you." Alara gave his hand a soft squeeze back and then let go. A few steps further, a woman reached out and lightly touched Alara's arm. "My boy," the woman whispered, more to herself than to Alara. "He played the piano." She looked at Alara's arm, then up at her face, offering a ghost of a smile. Alara smiled back, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "He would have loved that," the woman added softly. Alara realized then that she hadn't just played a song. She had opened a door for them. Through the simple notes, they had walked back into their own pasts. They had heard their own children playing, their own parents singing, or their own youthful dreams echoing in the chords. She wasn't Alara, the music student, anymore. She was a bridge to their memories. She continued to walk slowly toward the large glass doors at the back of the room. Another resident, a woman who had been knitting earlier, simply reached out and grazed Alara's skirt as she passed, a gentle touch of connection. It was like receiving a blessing from everyone in the room. Alara felt a lump in her throat, but it didn't hurt. It felt like love. She reached the sliding glass doors. She paused for a moment and looked back. The room was still quiet. The spell hadn't broken yet. The residents were still sitting in their semicircle, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. They looked peaceful, united by the invisible thread the music had woven between them. No one was looking at the clock. No one was asking when dinner was. They were just resting in the feeling. Mrs. Gable walked over to the door with her. "I don't know what to say," the director whispered, her voice low so as not to disturb the room. "That was beautiful, truly." Alara looked at her and nodded. "They just wanted something real," she said softly. "I should have known that." Mrs. Gable pressed a button on the wall, and the glass doors slid open with a quiet hiss. Alara stepped out into the hallway. The air here was cooler, smelling of floor wax and the faint scent of laundry detergent. The sounds of the facility, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the distant ring of a phone, the beep of a cart, came rushing back to her. But the noise didn't bother her anymore. It seemed distant and unimportant compared to the silence she had just left behind. She walked down the long corridor toward the main exit. Her heels clicked on the floor, but the sound seemed lighter than before. She thought about the conservatory, about the practice rooms with their soundproof walls, about the professors who judged every note. She realized she had learned more in this 1 hour at the Hillcrest facility than she had in months of classes. She learned that technique was just a tool. It was the vessel, not the water. The water was the emotion, the connection, the simple truth of being human. She pushed open the heavy door at the front of the building and stepped outside. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The air was fresh and cool. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs. Alara walked to her car, unlocked the door, and threw her bag onto the passenger seat. As she sat in the driver's seat and looked at the building through the windshield, she smiled. She knew that when she went back to school on Monday, she would play differently. She would play for the heart, not for the hand. She started the engine. She didn't feel tired anymore. She felt full. As she drove away, she left the Ratchmanin off and the fear behind her, carrying only the memory of the silence, the touch of trembling hands, and the simple, powerful knowledge that she had finally, truly made music.